Last week I talked about the presence of God in our worship, and this week I'm going to talk about our preparation for worship. And I've chosen to talk about worship the past last week, this week, and next time I preach, because I think what worship has to offer us is something that we take for granted, and I think that it's something that allows us to really fill up our faith and allow us to engage ourselves in our faith and further it. So when I talked about the presence of God last week in our worship, it was that he was there with us while we worship and what it allows us to do when he's there for us. However, we can't simply come to worship every week or wherever we worship, however often we worship, and just expect that God will be there with us, for us, and moving in us. So we have to prepare for that worship. We have to prepare our hearts and minds and souls so that we are able to worship in spirit and in truth. The idea of preparation is something that we all know very well, I think. Even if you're a procrastinator, I think we all know how to prepare. I think I can be a procrastinator, at least with schoolwork sometimes. Hannah, on the other hand, loves doing homework. It's her favorite thing to do every night. I promise you, she spends so much time doing it. She prepares for school. She prepares for homework. She prepares for tests. She prepares for color guard, marching band, show choir. She's constantly preparing for whatever's going on in her life. And I think we all prepare for what's going on in our lives. We prepare for job interviews and what we're supposed to say, what kind of questions they're going to ask us, or how we're going to dress and enable ourselves to hopefully get that job. We also prepare for big presentations at work or speeches, other things that we deem as important and of, something that is going to enable us to move a step farther in life. So we spend all of our time preparing for school, job, work, whatever it is. But when we take the time to prepare for that stuff, why don't we take the time to prepare for our worship for a God who's so powerful and amazing and beyond our comprehension? Why don't we take the time to think about how we're going to worship him? Why do we come to church just expecting that since whoever two or more are gathered, he will be there also, and that he's going to do miraculous things? In order for us to experience God's presence, we have to prepare ourselves. We have to prepare how we're coming into worship, how we're ready to surrender to God, offer our bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, how we prepare our minds to put aside whatever we're struggling with in our daily life, how we prepare our hearts to worship, not with just the words on the screen, but with our hearts giving everything to God. This passage that I picked, it seems like a weird one to talk about preparation for worship. It kind of says some mumbo jumbo, and then it gets into verse 28 where it says, "Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe." And that's pretty much all it says about worship. Since we're receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken from a God who cannot be shaken and is powerful and almighty, let us worship in reverence and awe. So when we come, in order to prepare ourselves, we need to worship with reverence and awe. We need to revere God. In verse 26, it says, "At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, once more I will shake not only the earth but also the heavens." And then in verse 29, at the very end, it says, "For our God is a consuming fire." No, he can shake the heavens and the earth. He's a consuming fire. This is just stuff that's proving how powerful and amazing our God is. It proves to us who he is in our lives and how he sent his son to die on a cross for us and our sins. When we think about all the things that he's done for us and all the things that he's going to do for us, how he's working in our lives, and how powerful he is over everything that we can and cannot understand, that puts in perspective how we need to revere God. We need to honor him in his power and truly acknowledge how great he is. I'm going to read a little passage from Exodus now. I know it's from the Old Testament, but it's good, I promise. It's Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. And it says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that, though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, 'I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up.' When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush and said, 'Moses, Moses.' Moses said, 'Here I am.' 'Do not come any closer,' God said. 'Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground.'" That is kind of a weird verse to talk about worship as well. But this goes back several years ago to when I went to camp for the first time. I've talked about summer games a lot while I've been preaching, and it's a great camp. If you get the chance, your kids should go. But I got there. They did a different way of picking who was going to be in their huddle back then. They had us line up by our age and our grade. And then all the huddle leaders were dressed up in costumes, and then they ran and picked you up and carried you over and like captured you. And so my first year, I was a little kid at this point, this guy dressed up as Iron Man came over, picked me up, threw me over his shoulder, and like ran off with me. I was like, oh, okay. I guess that's how camp works. But it was great. I didn't know what to expect that first week. And what I got to see through him was this example of what living a Christ-like life is, but also how to prepare for worship. He was constantly preparing for worship. And he didn't look like the guy that you would expect to be that guy. He had a beard and tattoos, and he didn't really wear shoes. Like, he didn't know what they were. He wore flip-flops when we had to go to the cafeteria. But he didn't wear shoes. And I didn't really understand why until we got to that verse. And not only did he not wear his shoes then, but he didn't wear his shoes like all year round. This wasn't just something he did because he's at camp. And he did it because of that passage where Moses was talking to God in the burning bush. And it says, "Take off your sandals, you are on holy ground." And that's something that I've done at camp, and it's something that I've done at Oakwood. Whether I'm leading worship there on Wednesday or Saturday, whenever it is, I usually am barefoot, so is Dustin and whoever else is doing worship with us. And so I'm going to take my shoes off now as well. I hope that's okay. I promise you won't smell them. And someone last night came up to me afterwards and said, "I was hoping you were going to tell us all to take our shoes off. So if you want to, you can as well, but you're sitting next to other people, so you might want to ask them first." But if you want to, you can. If that's how you worship and feel and realize that we're on holy ground. And I know a school building doesn't seem like holy ground. We're in a gym in a school, that's not holy ground. That's not, necessarily what we think of when we think about worshiping. But it is. We can worship wherever we want to. We can prepare ourselves for worship wherever we want to. And the idea of taking this wherever we go, taking the fact that Moses understood who God was and respected him enough to be able to revere him and be in awe of him in this burning bush that wasn't even burning, to take off his shoes, acknowledge that he's on holy ground with God. So whether you're actually on consecrated holy ground or whether you're going for a walk, think about how you're able to revere God, whether it's with your shoes on or off, whether it's in a church building or not. However you do it, think about how you're revering God, how you're acknowledging his presence when you come to worship. It's because we don't anticipate seeing God and hearing his voice, anticipate his presence, that we are unable to experience his presence. When we allow ourselves to revere God and come into worship expecting that, that's when we're going to see God. That's when we're going to feel his presence through worship. The other thing you need to do is you need to be humble when you worship God. You need to have a certain sense of humility. In these verses, it talks about how we're on earth and God is in heaven. We all know that. But that puts in perspective for us when we come to worship. We are on earth, God is in heaven. We can't come to worship being all prideful. Can't come to worship having this high opinion of ourselves. We need to recognize that God is in heaven and is powerful over us. In verse 27, really the whole passage, it talks about how we refuse people who speak on earth, and we were unable to escape. So then, if we refuse him who speaks in heaven, we certainly will not be able to escape. And he says, once more I will shake the heavens and the earth. The idea that we can't reject God, we can't refuse him in heaven, we can't refuse what he's saying to us, that puts in perspective. That puts in perspective about how we need to worship humbly, come prepared to be humble. And Jesus told his disciples one time, he told them about this story where there was a person worshiping in front of the church, and it was someone who was actually like a big, important guy. He came, he's standing in front of the church, he's standing tall and mighty with his arms up in the air, and he's worshiping. However, there's a guy in the back, and he was far away from the altar, far away from God, and he was down on his knees crying out to God. And he was a low-life guy. He wasn't just any normal guy. He was below average. When we think about how we're coming to worship, we don't necessarily need to be on our knees, but the guy who is in the back revering God, humbly on his knees, admitting that God is in heaven and has power over us here on earth, that's how we need to worship. We need to worship acknowledging who God is and what he's doing. We need to worship in a way that puts everything in perspective. Being humble and coming prepared to worship is about our perspective. It's about how when we come to church, we are kind of stuck in what we're doing in our normal lives. We're stuck in what we're struggling with. We're stuck in other things that maybe we need to be preparing for. However, when we come and humble ourselves and offer ourselves to God, that is when we are able to see things from His perspective and see how He's working in our lives. Because sometimes we are so caught up in everything that's going on that we think there's one way that you need help, one way that things can go right. However, God is working in our lives, and us being caught up in the perspective of our own daily troubles draws us farther away from God. When we're humble, we're able to slow down, communicate with God, be in His presence, and acknowledge what is happening in our lives through His perspective. We have problems once we get to worship and we start. Even if we come prepared in reverence and awe, we have problems when we get here actually hearing what He's saying and actually doing it. The problem is we don't listen really to anything anymore in our society and our everyday lives. So a while ago, my dad's in Scotland. We got to go to Scotland with him. It was a lot of fun. Did a lot of traveling. But I'd been on many plane flights before that. So I knew everything that was going on. I knew how to get on the plane and, all the rules that they had. So even before I got on the plane, I already had my phone out. I already had my headphones in. And I was ready to, as soon as I sat down, start playing Guardians of the Galaxy on my phone and watching it on that really long flight. And I didn't listen to a single thing that the flight attendants were saying because, man, Guardians of the Galaxy is a good movie. But I didn't listen. I didn't listen at all. Granted, I believe I know what I should have done if something bad had happened, but the point is I wasn't listening. And we do that all the time now. We are on our phones constantly, not paying attention to those around us, or not paying attention to what they're saying, what they're doing. We don't pay attention or listen to anything in our daily lives. And that applies to when we come to worship with God. Now, it's not that He doesn't have things to say to us, because God is talking to us and moving in our lives and doing stuff for us. But sometimes we have our headphones in and we aren't listening. Sometimes we'd rather be watching a movie, going to some event. We'd rather be doing something more important than worshiping God. But God is trying to talk to us through our worship. He's there and He's present. So if we take those headphones out and we're able to listen to what God is saying, if we're able to come ready for worship, if we're able to come prepared, His presence will be here with us, like I talked about last week, and He'll be talking and we'll be listening. That goes along with what it was saying in verse 25, where it talks about how we refuse people on earth. We don't listen to those flight attendants, even though they know what's right for us. We don't listen to the people around us. And sometimes we don't listen to God in heaven, the maker of the universe. We don't listen to Him. But if we don't listen to Him, how are we going to escape? How are we supposed to survive on this earth that is just temporary, that He's going to shake and destroy someday and create this awesome heaven? We can't come to worship without listening, and we can't take God for granted. Now, we come to worship often very casually, not necessarily how we dress. I'm not wearing shoes right now. It's not about how we dress, but it's about how we come prepared. We come to worship casually, expecting that if God is so powerful, he's going to do this stuff for us even when we're not doing anything for him. And that's not what faith is about. He gives us the choice to want to follow him. He gives us the choice to worship him every week. He gives us the ability to live out our faith. He gives us the ability to choose to further our faith. And we're able to do that through worship. We're able to draw close to God, communicate, and be in his presence when we worship, when we don't take it for granted, when we don't come casually. The idea that we get to choose to love our God who sent his son down, die on the cross for us, is awesome. The idea that we come prepared to worship, we come ready to further our faith, and he's going to be there and do great things in our lives. That's awesome. However, if we come casually, not prepared, burdened by what we're going through in everyday life, that's going to slow us down in our faith and draw us farther away from God. And I'm not saying you have to come with your life perfectly in order to have an awesome time with God, but I'm saying when you come to worship, you have to come ready to do exactly what the verse talked about last week, the Romans 12:1 and 2. Come prepared to offer your body as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. Holy and pleasing. You're coming prepared as a holy sacrifice, so that you're not conformed to this world, but you're transformed by the renewal of your mind, that through testing, you're able to discern what the good will of God is. Not only the good will, but the perfect will of God is. His good, pleasing, and perfect will. His will for each one of you in your lives. And you're able to do that when you come to worship as a holy sacrifice. When you come worshiping in spirit and in truth, as he told one of the women who asked Jesus, we're on holy ground, whether we're in a school building or whether we're at home, whether we're in the car worshiping, like I talked about last week, how that's one of my favorite places to worship. We're on holy ground. Whether you have your shoes on or off, wherever you go with God in your life, you are on holy ground as long as you are with him and in his presence. And when you come prepared to revere God, that's when you're going to see him in your worship. Worship is a serious thing. It's a powerful thing. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, this powerful kingdom that God, who we can't even comprehend, someone who's so powerful that the only way to describe them is that they're powerful beyond measure and that we will never have the slightest idea of who they are and what they can do. This amazing God created a kingdom that cannot be shaken, so let us be thankful. Let us worship God acceptably, with reverence and awe, as a holy and living sacrifice to God. We can't expect miracles to happen through worship when we don't come prepared. We can't expect to feel his presence when we don't come prepared. Even though it says in Matthew, it says, where two more are gathered, I'm there also. I think it says, what it actually says is where two more are gathered in my name. If you just come and you gather, that's not doing anything. You have to come and you have to gather in his name. You have to come prepared, willing to worship. You have to come revering this powerful God who is a consuming fire. Being able to worship is this awesome gift from God. Being able to become one with God, to enter into this thin space, to feel his presence, to feel him moving. That's awesome and special and something that doesn't happen often enough. It's not about having a full band. It's not about singing certain songs. It's about how you come ready to worship with your heart and in spirit and truth. It's not about coming casually. If we come ready to revere God, to worship in awe, to be humble and listen to God, if we come ready to lay down everything that we're dealing with in our everyday lives, that's when we're truly going to see God in worship. We're going to feel his power and his presence because we prepared. Just like we prepare for everything else in our everyday lives, we prepare for worship. As I wrap things up, I encourage you to think about how you're taking God's presence with you wherever you go, how you're prepared to be with him whenever the moment arises, whether you're on holy ground or you're going to make that holy ground by revering God and his presence with you. Moses was just on a mountain. We're in a school. Wherever you are, acknowledge who God is. Acknowledge what he's doing in your life. Revere him and be ready to know that he's going to move in your life. Don't come to worship. Don't come and worship just casually. Come prepared. Prepared to sing these last two songs. Prepared for next week and the songs. Prepared for singing in the car. Prepared for whenever you're worshiping God and however you're worshiping God. Don't be scared to worship him however you feel you're led to worship him, however you feel connected to God. Be prepared to feel his presence.